Hello and welcome to the Rebel tier maker. This one is the Rebellion tier list. So if you've never seen one of these tier list videos before, you have an S to D tier ranking, S being the best, D tier being the worst, and then we have all of the Rebel Navy here, except the fighters. We will not do the fighters in this video. We have all of the Rebellion's Navy and Awakening Rebellion, and we're going to rank each unit from best to worst. Starting us off, let's go and get right into it. Starting us off, we have the Alliance Assault Frigate. Now, I love the Alliance Assault Frigate. I think it fits the Rebellion style very, very well. I think it is very, very strong. It's not super expensive. It's a kind of slightly cheaper option versus something that's like a capital ship, but it's also very, very hard hitting. Now, it is also too expensive to mass produce. The only problem is you kind of do have to mass produce them. Only using one is very dangerous. I like to use them as attack groups. I like to bring them in from reserve behind the enemy lines and kind of have their close range turbo lasers just go to ham on different Star Destroyers and anything supporting the Star Destroyers as well, because they have really accurate turbo lasers. Because they're so close, their close range turbo lasers are usually a little bit more effective, and they can really wreak some havoc if used correctly. Now the thing is, their close range turbo lasers get them into a lot of trouble. Like I said, the best way to use them, if possible, is to bring them in from reserve already behind the enemy ISDs and different units like that. If you put them in front and bring them in at the beginning of the battle and try and rush them past the ISDs, you're very likely going to lose one of them, and they're not cheap enough to where you just want to throw them away. They still cost over 5,000 credits, so a very, very good unit, high upside. Like I said, they're really, really heavy hitting for how cheap they are. So really, really high upside, but can be costly if you don't use them correctly. Boat cruisers. Now, boat cruisers are great. I'm putting them in C tier because they are very fragile and they get out-teched really quickly. They are great in the beginning of the game. They're great screeners. They have a really good weapon array. They have a lot of different weapons, and they're great for screening. They have a tractor beam, which is fairly nice. I don't think the tractor beam still works correctly in this mod, but what am I to say? The boat cruiser is pretty fragile, though. You have to be careful. Luckily, it is fairly cheap, but still, you're going to have to replace them pretty often, but they're really, really good support units. The interdictor, the CC-77, I think this is called. The interdictor is the interdictor. This thing is, you don't ever see this in any Star Wars show or movie that's popular, and you don't want to build them because they're ugly and you don't want them to be in the battle, but interdictors are way too valuable not to have. So you put them in the fleet, put them at the very far edge of the map. You never use them in combat, but interdictors are an automatic A tier pretty much every time. CR90s. Now, CR90s, in my opinion, are probably the best unit in the entire game. No tech requirement, extremely fast, extremely quick and maneuverable, extremely cheap, really good weapon systems, having laser cannons. Let's see, what do they have? They have laser cannons and heavy laser cannons, or I might be forgetting. They might be point defense lasers, but I think, yeah. They're really, really good. They're really good hunters, so they are very good at anti-corvette duties. They're great for screening against fighters. Like I said, they're very maneuverable, so you can move them about the battlefield to help focus down enemy fighters or gunships, as well as they are actually really good against bigger targets. Because they're so fast and have good ability and the boost engines ability, if you see some enemy artillery units, like some Architans or even some Tonfolks in the back of the enemy fleet, you can have them use their speed and their boost engine power ability, punch them through the enemy lines. Because they're so small, enemy turbo lasers won't hit it. So you can really have them punch through the enemy lines and go in from behind and take out those artillery units or the carriers. So yeah, my opinion, probably the best unit in the game. Now, I know a lot of people like a couple other of these units, not pointing my mouse at them, but I have reasons why these are better. The Dauntless Battle Cruiser, I think this is called. The Dauntless is really good. It's an A tier unit, but I don't think it's as good as AAFs. AAFs are the cruiser variant of Dauntlesses. They have the same close range turbo lasers, but they're much cheaper. The thing about the Dauntless is they require Sora Sub Tech 2, which cost you, I think, a total of 30,000. No, I think it's actually more than 30,000 credits to get both 1 and 2 techs. for source up. So it's really, really expensive to even unlock these units. And then each one costs over like 22,000 credits. So they are really, really expensive. But they are still really, really effective. Just like the AAF, you have to be very careful with them because of their close range. They like to get really up close and personal. With the ISDs, they kind of like to hug them. Metaphorically and honestly physically. When I was making a joke by saying hugging, and then I realized I pictured it in my mind. I was like, how often do you see a Dauntless right next to an ISD? But with all that being said, the weaknesses of them, they are heavy hitting. They are not only have the close range turbo lasers that the AAFs have, but they also come with close range ion cannons, I believe, too. And they have so many weapon systems that if you put them right in between two ISDs, it'll fire both broadsides at either one of the ISDs. So it's really, really effective. They just have a really low survivability and are really expensive. But other than that, they're still an A tier unit. Don't get me wrong. I know I'm bashing it right now, but it's still an A tier unit. I like the AAF a little bit more. It's more my playstyle. The DP20 is S tier. It's not as good as the CR90. Hear me out. This is the reason why. It's a little bit more expensive, which isn't that big of a deal, right? But the biggest reason why it's not as good as the CR90, like I said, it's S tier. I'm not bashing it, but it takes Tech 3. You're not going to have this thing right off the bat in your campaigns like the CR90 is. Now, very similar to the CR90, it is extremely small, which makes it extremely hard to hit by turbo lasers. It has great weapon systems. It can perform the screener role, and it's really good in the hunter role. Probably even better than the CR90. Really, really good in the screener role. The hunter role. It can perform the screener role. It still acts as a Corvette. It is really fast and maneuverable, and so good at hunting down Corvettes, frigates, even cruisers, some cruisers, because of their assault missiles that are just really, really good at wreaking havoc. Okay, so I actually just checked. The CR90s do have laser cannons and heavy laser cannons, so they're really, really good at that. They're okay at the screener role. They're really good against gunships, but they're also really good against Corvettes as well. The DB20s have point defense lasers, so they are very good at that screener role, able to take out fighters as well, and they're just a really, really solid unit. Once you get the tech, I really recommend building these. The Dreadnought. The Dreadnought is an immediate B tier. It is so good and honestly so crucial at the beginning, early stages of the rebellion because they're cheap. And as the rebellion, you need your tanks. You have to have your tanks to allow things like your CR90s and your AAFs and your boat cruisers to stay alive, the boat cruisers. But allowing the CR90s and the AAFs to deal damage, as well as allowing your fighter squadrons to gain fighter superiority and then have them do damage, as well as your bombers. The Dreadnought themselves, although their weapon systems look appealing, their close-range turbo lasers require them to be really close, and so they actually don't end up doing all that much damage, even though when you look at their weapon systems, you kind of wish they would do a little bit more. But I've done some decent studies on the Dreadnoughts when I was making some other videos, and they're actually not that good at dealing damage, but when it comes to tanking damage, they're really good. And honestly, they're actually really high survivability rate. You typically lose one at a time. If you do lose one, you only lose one, and they're only around 4,000 credits, so they're pretty cheap. Dreadnoughts, they could be A tier. They're closer to A tier than they are C tier, but Dreadnoughts are immediate B tiers. The GR75. Now, the GR75 is a low A tier. It's a fleet tender. It's really, really good. It has that kind of semi-screener role-ish. It has, I think, point defense lasers. So it's able to take out fighters. Now, honestly, it really can't even take out like a lot of fighters. If one of these things is alone, it can get picked off by a good fighter squadron or two. So be careful with that. But I mean, it has the fleet tender ability. It can repair other units. Whether they have hard points, it'll heal their hard points. And if they don't have hard points, it'll heal the entire ship themselves. So combining these with fast ships like the CR90 and the DP20, have them go in combat, take damage, and then come back and retreat to a fleet tender. The GR75s are very, very strong. In my opinion, they're not as good as the Empire Star Galleons, but at least they're much cheaper. The price of the GR75 alone takes it out of B tier and puts it in A tier. They're really, really cheap, so if you do lose them, it's not a big deal at all. Hammerheads. Hammerheads are good. I'm going to put them in B tier. Hear me out. You're just not going to build all that many of them because CR90s and DP20s are just better. Now, Hammerheads are a little bit tankier. They also have the blockade run ability, so they're a little bit better at punching through enemy lines to take out enemy backline units like artillery and carriers. But I just find myself not really building all that many. They're a little bit more expensive than CR90s. They don't have quite as good weapon systems. They do have one light turbo laser. They have two light turbo lasers, which is actually pretty good. So they're a little bit heavier hitting than something like a CR90 is, but you know, I think the biggest weakness and drawback of them is you just don't build that many of them because CR90s and DP20s are just a little bit more superior. But they're still a low B tier unit. They're still definitely worth building. They're worth keeping alive when you start out with them, so pretty good units. The MC80 Independents. Now, MC80 Independences are hard to get. They're, as you can see, 30,000 credits, which is pretty dang expensive. I think that's the, I think that's the most expensive unit in the Rebel. I think in all of the Rebellion. Anything you can build on the Rebellion, I think that's the most expensive thing. They're hard to get. You have to do an entire mission line in order to get them. On top of that, they're expensive, but they do their job. That's why they're in S tier. They do their job. They're extremely tanky. They dominate the battlefield, which I love. That's what I want my capital ships to do. I want their presence to be felt. When I bring them in from reserves, I want the immediate shift to be felt in my favor. I want the battlefields, like, I'm losing my words here, but I want the outcome of the battlefield to shift immediately in my favor when I bring in a super capital ship. And that's what happens when you bring in the MC Independence. Great ion weaponry, great shields, great damage, just an all-around S tier unit. Liberators. Liberators are really good. They are slightly high-tech. They're not super high-tech. I think they cost Source Subtech 1. But they have a great hangar bay. They are fairly small, not super small, but they're slightly hard to hit, and they're slightly tanky, not really tanky at all, but they have a little bit of health to them. And like I said, great hangar bay, great weapon systems, a lot of different weapons for them, and they're not super expensive. So I mean, just exactly B tier, really good B tier unit all around. You can build a couple of them. You're not going to build a ton of them, but they're decent units. The Marauder. Just like the Architans, the Marauder for me is a C tier unit. Hear me out before you go and fight me like you did with the Architans. I think they're better than Architans, but I still think they're C tier because honestly, the Rebellion has to have some sort of C tier units. I think the Twin Blade's better. It's more my style. It's a little bit more heavy hitting, so I think the Twin Blade is better than the Marauder. The Marauder is that artillery unit. Now, the one thing that the Marauder does have that I really, really like is it has long-range ion weaponry, which is really rare in this game, period. But that's about it. They're cheap. They just don't do enough damage for me. I agree. They're really good. Their survivability rate is through the roof because they're so small, they're hard to hit, and they're artillery units. They're way in the back. Plus, they're cheap and replaceable. I just don't find myself building that many of them. I'd rather have something take up a little bit more population space in a Twin Blade frigate that does a little bit more damage. So the biggest drawback for me in the Marauder is it just doesn't deal enough damage. With that being said, I still like the unit. It has cool weapon systems, but I just don't ever use them. Now, that's my Architans for this video. You can drop a comment immediately and tell me that this video sucks, like I did with the Architans, but with every tier list, I get one... Whoops, I'm not being clicked out. I get one draw. Okay, that's my draw. Now, my second draw is the MC30. I really am not a big MC30 person. Now, the funny thing about the MC30 that some people don't seem to know about, the MC30 has been nerfed, I think, 4 times. 4 times, and it's still an S tier unit. But in my opinion, the reason why it's not an S tier unit, hear me out. Pause before you drop a comment saying I suck. They take Tech 3, which is hard to get. They also require a lot of money because they're fragile. They die easily. It's hard to use them in every battle without losing at least one of them. They also have to travel in packs. In my opinion, only having one MC30 is not enough. Usually you're going to want to have at least 2 if not 3 or 4, and have them travel in packs. And I think that's a big weakness because that means they take up a lot of tactical population space. Which is funny because if you look at my comment section and my Discord, a lot of people just say that they have fleets of like 10 or 11 of these, and they just go crazy with the MC30. So in my opinion, that's a weakness. I don't think that it's amazing for a unit to have so many on the battlefield before their powers fell. With that being said, they're still an A tier unit. They're still very, very good. Alright, moving on to the MC40. Now, the MC40 is going to be my only D tier unit. Now, I know a lot of people do love the MC40, but in my opinion, it takes up tech. It takes a lot of tech to build. It's expensive. It's too big for its own size, which means it gets hit by heavy turbolasers. Not heavy turbolasers, but like a lot of turbolasers. And that means it dies really easily, and you have to replace it, costing a lot of money. And that's why I just don't really like the MC40. In my opinion, it's just not all that great. I know a lot of people do love it, but it's going to be the one D tier unit in the Rebellion. Now, the MC60, in my opinion, is just a better version of the MC40. I'm going to put it, honestly, low C tier. I think when I ran through this, I had it in B tier, but I think I'm going to have it in C tier. I don't build a lot of them. I don't build a lot of ion-specific ships in my Rebel fleets. That's never really the biggest deal, ion weaponry. I usually don't use a lot of ship-to-ship combat with my Rebel fleets. I usually have like a lot of AAFs, or usually it's a lot of fighter squadrons. But yeah, in my opinion, the MC60, it's got good iron weaponry and different missile variants, but it's very large, takes a lot of tech, expensive, which means if you lose them, you just don't want to have to replace them. And a lot of the time, in my experience with Awakening Rebellion, I have well over 2,000 hours of just game time. Now, if you count YouTube, I've got thousands of hours into this mod already. But you just don't really feel the power of ion-focused ships or Magpulse and different rocket-type ships. You just don't feel they're very powerful. So low C tier for the MC60 and the only D tier units for the MC40. Now, the MC88 is a low B tier. Here's the thing about the MC88. It takes Tech 3, and honestly, it's like the only... I think it's the really only... Maybe the MC88 Independence, obviously. But I think it's the only unit you get from Tier 3 warship tech. I'm probably forgetting something, but for that reason alone, there's no real reason to go for Tech 3 until you want to get Independences, because this thing is just not worth building. In my experience, I don't do a lot of artillery warfare, and don't get me wrong, the MC88 is really, really good at doing artillery warfare, which is its role. It does great damage, but what's funny about the MC88 is it's too tanky for its own good. If I had my Mon Cala friends, if I had a chance to talk to Admiral Akbar, I would be like, hey, reduce the amount of armor and shielding this thing has and make it cheaper. Please. It's so expensive, and it's an artillery ship. It's not going to get into that deep combat all that often. Its range for an artillery ship isn't all that great, but it's still an artillery ship. Its range is much better than an MC75, but it doesn't need to be that tanky. I wish it was a little bit cheaper. It's really, really cheap. I mean, really, really expensive. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. It's a low B tier unit. If you want to build them, they're not bad. I just don't see a reason to build them or the technology required for them. MC80 Freedoms, they're good. They are capable of 1v1ing an ISD. Now, not many capital ships, other than maybe a Dauntless, a Freedom, and a Liberty, are capable of 1v1ing an ISD. All of them lose, I think, maybe unless a Dauntless could win. The Freedom will lose a 1v1 with an ISD. But it is capable of 1v1ing an ISD with the Rebellion's fighter superiority. If you have fighter superiority, then your X-Wings and your Y-Wings and B-Wings and different units can focus on the ISD as well, and that's when the Freedom is capable of beating the ISD. It has really good shield leech ability, allowing it to stay alive longer. It is slightly cheap. It's not super cheap, but it's not expensive. And for performing the capital ship role, it does a really good job. The MC80 Justice. Now, I'm not a big fan of the MC80 Justice. It's still a B tier unit. It's cheap. It requires no technology, and it's very, very cheap, which is extremely important for an early game Rebellion capital ship. It costs less than 15,000 credits, which for a capital ship period is really, really good. I think it's the cheapest capital ship, actually. For a true capital ship, I'm pretty sure it's the cheapest, but the Emissary Justice is pretty good. It has really, really good ability, and honestly, that's really the only reason why people build these things, is for its ability. Because the most discussed thing for the Emissary Justice is a potential complement, a fighter complement upgrade for it, because it has a decent hangar bay, but the ships it gets are just, the fighters it gets, ships I guess works, but the fighters it gets are just not very good. So they get outclassed really easily. So early game, the MC-80 Justice is extremely, extremely good because it's cheap and you have to build some sort of capital ship. It fills the capital ship role, which is really important. Outside of the early game, you just stop building them. The only reason why you would ever build them is for the ability that it has, the shield bubble ability. Next on the list is the MC-80 Justice. Now the MC-80 Justice is really, really good. I said Justice. I meant Liberty. Sorry, I was just talking about the Justice. The MC-80 Liberty. The MC-80 Liberty is everything you could dream for in a Rebel capital ship. It's tanky. It has good it's not long-range weaponry, but it keeps away from being in close range. It has good ranged weaponry. It has ion weapons. It has turbo lasers. It is fairly cheap, not expensive at least. It doesn't take up a ton of population cap, but it is exactly what you want in a capital ship, which is why it is an A tier unit. I like it even more than Dauntlesses, because Dauntlesses die really easily. Or at least they don't die easily, but they die. MC-80 or MC-75s, I'll put them low B tier. They're not C tier, they're just really fragile. Because they're so fragile, it's because of their close range weapons. They like to get stuck in, and they like to hug, enemy capital ships, kind of like the Dauntless. So they just die kind of easily. They have good armor and good shields, but they just get so close. And once they get in close, they're way too slow to get out. You're going to build probably 1 or 2 of these per campaign because they don't require too much technology, and they're not too expensive. So they're still B tier, low B tier, but I still like them. Now, the Nebulon B, I'm not the biggest Nebulon B guy. Where do I want to put it, though? Probably the highest unit B tier. Now, that's another one of my, relax before we go to the comment section. I still think they're good. They're high B tier. They're above average. The only thing about them is they die too easily. They're too big. They're really thin, so turbo lasers still miss them most of the time, but sometimes light turbo lasers can just rip these things apart. Heavy laser cannons, assault missiles, just rip these things apart. Now, they do have one of the best abilities in the game, the Missile Gem ability. They are very, very good. I actually really like their weapon systems as well. Their weapon systems are pretty good. They have a variety of weapons, including turbo lasers. So they're able to provide escort roles, and they're not bad units. They're really not. They also have a long pro Y-wing and good sensor range themselves. So I do think that they're a very, very good unit. They're borderline A tier even for me. Now, I know a lot of y'all like to have them even all the way up in S tier or high A tier, but in my opinion, they just die too easily, and I don't see myself... No, I do replace them. I usually have about 1 or 2 of these in every battle. Not in reserves, but in every battle. So I probably should put them in A tier. The last 2 units we have are Quasars. Now, I don't have the 2 different variants, but I have 2 of them. This is the fighter variant. The fighter variant is very, very good. It has 2 X-Wing squadrons with 4 in reserve and 1 U-Wing squadron. You can't go wrong with Quasars. Both of them are going to go B tier. Here's the thing. I'm going to put the fighter one above the Y-Wing one. So the fighter one, let's talk about the fighter one first. The fighter one has 2 X-Wing squadrons with 4 in reserve and 1 U-Wing squadron. Now, personally, this is my personal tier maker list. When I play as the Rebellion, I use individual fighter squadrons. I buy individual fighter squadrons. That's why I don't have these as S tier or A tier. I think they're not as good as individual fighter squadrons because they don't die. They have high survivability, but the amount of fighters they provide just isn't enough. So that's why I like to particularly put out my individual squads rather than having Quasars. Now, the reason I have the fighter better than the bomber is because if I'm going to have a Quasar, I'm going to have the fighter squadron because the reserve aspect of it. How often do you want to bring in a Quasar that has bombers, and then once those 2 bomber squadrons die, you have to replace them, re-micromanage. That's the reason why I don't like the bomber Quasars. I just don't want to have to micromanage bomber squadrons every other minute. Because if those first 2 die and the B-Wing squadron dies, you're going to have to re-micromanage them, and that just takes a lot of time away from the other parts of the battlefield. So I think that the Bomber Quasar is low B tier, and the Fighter Quasar is still high B tier. You do have to micro them a little bit, because if you have your Quasar way in the back lines, away from the fight, you do have to at least bring up the X-Wings, but at least with the X-Wings, you can highlight them, and then just place them in the battlefield. You don't have to micro them like the bomber squadrons you do. So in my opinion, Quasars are still good. I know a lot of people like them in S tier, but in my opinion, I like to build individual squadrons. And yeah, that is my Rebellion tier list. Now, what's interesting about the Rebellion tier list, only 1 unit in D tier, and only 1 real unit in C tier. I could easily have both the Bolt Cruiser and the Marauder in B tier, but I wanted to have it a little bit more balanced out. So the Rebellion has really good balance in all of its units, as you can see. But as always, the tier maker is online. If you type in tiermaker.com and then in the search bar you type in Awakening the Rebellion, like AOTR Rebel Space Units, it'll pop up. Join my Discord. Drop your comment down below about what you think about my tier maker list and what you would do with your tier maker list, or join my Discord. It'll be linked in the description below, and you can make your own tier list and pop it in my Discord and have me and other people react to it. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and you don't roast me too much in the comments.